series on the 1830s to 1860s. Some of the best content I think we've done so far. And if you like it, please share it on Facebook, tweet it, spread the word.
Thoughts are give context for the global situation, what's happening. Like 1840s, you would have the Mexican-American War, and you have the first Opium War, and that sort of exemplifies the political economic landscape of what's going on. You have the California gold strike in '49, and you have the expansion of the West.
Yeah,
Polk's in charge, and then who's after Polk?
I wanted to start it off from the very beginning of this as like, what's old is new again, or what's new was old before, or how would I say that?
Well, you have classical economics running up against the Industrial Revolution, which is destroying sort of the things that they're built on.
Yeah.
And then you have a new rise of economists, Carey, Marx, coming out of reacted to the realities of the Industrial Revolution,
right? Yeah.
And what's going on at that, and sort of the market revolution that's going on, the capital revolution was happening, the rise of these huge, this is the rise of the nouveau riche, the Vanderbilts starting to become incredibly wealthy. You have railroad barons and steamship barons and new technological realities. The peak distances are shorter now.
Right.
You can send things across the ocean and it won't take months and months and months. You have a higher trade tariff going on in the United States, and so Britain is producing lots of these manufactured goods that are shipping to America and are undercutting the prices. So there is these rise for tariffs because you have Webster and Henry Clay that are running the Congress. Someone like Jackson, who still was a nationalist. I mean, when South Carolina tried to get rid of all tariffs, he said no.
Yeah, the nullification crisis, and coming down on the right side of that, showing that someone that's an agent, quote unquote, or someone that's employed for various ends doesn't even have to know it themselves. That how these people are radicalized, or you find someone that's very ignorant in a certain realm. I mean, like how Gallatin manipulated Jefferson and Madison against the bank because they didn't fundamentally understand economics. One of these books I had here recently was Jefferson was a polymath and a genius in everything but finance, where he was an idiot. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's what was going on. That was the truth. So, something like with Jackson, he wasn't a trader per se, but he economically was subscribed to these notions that did not work. I don't like banks. That was his economic policy. That's not going to cut it. So why do we focus on the 1840s? That, I think, is a principal thing, right? Because it's of this country. We'll probably never have to invoke Godwin's law. So we're not going to be talking about Nazi Germany, the most go-to mystified kind of thing to ever talk about. There's a lot of parallels here with the collapse of the Whig Party. The rise and fall of the Whig Party, basically, is what we're focusing on, that are analogous to what's going on today. And it's interesting because you see the parallels, and they're so stark that, a lot of this stuff could have been yesterday's politics or, current contemporary things going on, because so much... For how much stuff does change, it really doesn't change that much.
Especially in this sort of time span, from 1840s to 2014. It's not that long.
Yeah, really. I mean, if the average adult lives to be 70, 74 years old, what's that?
3 generations?
Yeah. That's yesterday in terms of history.
So you have these classical economists, I would say, typified by Adam Smith, is sort of the godfather. And, Malthus, who serves an entirely different purpose from most economists. He is sort of the cornerstone of the anti-people, anti-development story of you have this balance you have to maintain with the earth, and if you don't maintain it, then calamity happens. And it's simply just anti-historical, anti-scientific nonsense. But he's very important for the landed gentry to keep development low and to have a reason to continue to hate their peasants.
And oppress them and deprive them and feel superior to them and all that kind of stuff.
And you have Ricardo, who is really the economist for the 1% of the Roundheads coming out of the English Civil War. He's much more manufacturing-oriented, market-oriented. He was a financial speculator. That's how he made his bones and sort of got chosen to be all these guys, Malthus and Ricardo, have these sort of meteoric rises that is analogous of being plucked by these higher powers to be mouthpieces for them and their agenda.
It's like Frédéric Bastiat of France. He was a radical libertarian writer in the 1840s, 1830s and 40s, and you get selected when he was basically inveighing against the French national tariff and national system as a classical liberal. And why do these people get prominence, right? Like with Helen Caldecott or something like that. Like they're saying whatever they're saying, and they probably believe what they're saying, right? But why do they have a platform, and why do other people not have a platform? When they get insider access to getting published, getting widespread, getting in the periodicals, getting a media platform, it means that big interests are served by those people in what they're saying, regardless if they believe it or know it or anything. It's always when you're hearing something, not only think of what you're hearing, but why you're hearing it. Equally as crucial, right? If you just think that these things are all getting to your ear, arriving to your ear and to your eye by their own merits, that's incredibly naive.
Yeah. And so you have these sort of establishment economists, that John Locke, people like that, they get this high-level position, and what are they really doing? I mean, David Ricardo is a servant of the new wing of the ruling class in Great Britain, the new market people instead of the landed people.
Yeah, that was the contention. It was, these forces were clashing heads. The landed aristocracy versus the new industrial and financial oligarchy.
During the English Civil War, which is what really those was about.
Yeah, where the industrial ones basically
won.
Yeah. And, relegated the landed gentry to kind of an ever declining amount of influence. And then also within the nouveau rich, you had the more industrialists versus the financier class, which is that became the new dynamic. No longer was it going to be the industrialists versus the landed aristocracy. Now it's going to be the industrialists versus the finance capitalists, basically. Mm-hmm. So that became the new social dynamic. I was arguing with someone recently about GMOs on Facebook, which, it's getting online arguments is always sometimes a temptation I can't resist. But, they're making Malthusian arguments, basically. We have to have Monsanto, and Monsanto's doing God's work, in effect, because we'd have massive starvation if Monsanto didn't exist. And, the earth is overpopulated in the same breath with that, and the only way to solve it is Monsanto. That has just layers of problems to it. But harping and leaning on Malthusian axioms is interesting, right? Because if you operate within your own lifespan of knowledge and what you think is going on in the world, you are totally screwed. Because, you cannot see the larger trends that go on, right? Imagine being alive for 300 years and just seeing, being born.
Like Dracula.
Yeah. Imagine just seeing what's going on,
Dan
right?
Carlin, who did this analogy.
Right.
But,
yeah, so imagine you're Dracula, right? Or you just are some kind of immortal person or something. You have an incredibly long lifespan. So you've been around for 200 years, 250 years, and you see demagogy that you've heard 100 years ago, and it hasn't changed at all. But when you're preaching that kind of demagogy to the modern person, they don't know anything about their own country's history or the world history at all. A lot of them can't even find major countries on a map, even their own country on a map, right? So the ruling class power, oligarchy, is incredibly emboldened and strengthened, and just demagogues in general, by having people not know any history, because you're operating within just this tiny time slice of awareness. Mm-hmm. And yet that accessibility to be, in effect, like Dracula in this sense, and have 300 years of awareness is at your fingertips.
Absolutely.
You can go do it. And then you're like, wow, like, then you're operating on a higher plane of comprehension, a higher plane of conceptualization of what's going on. So you're not going to be fooled by crackerjack ideology. It's just not going to get anywhere with you. And so we all need to just raise our level of conceptualization of like how we think about the world's problems and become more sophisticated. When you're in a higher realm of having some historical awareness, then these problems do not look nearly as surmountable as someone that's just, had nothing but like forums and, Infowars.com and the glowingness of their monitor and watching these fear porn documentaries.
Yeah.
It's like, that will get you nowhere. That's just
Illuminati in the music business.
Yeah, the symbology of
oh my god, that's a
a
rabbit hole you could spend months down.
Yeah, the Miley Cyrus Satanistic symbols. It's like, oh wow,
she's wearing a checkered blazer. Oh god,
it just never ends. Like, okay, like maybe some of that shit's going on, but like, what does it do for you? Like, what do you get out of it? It's like Dark Side of the Moon with Wizard of Oz or something. Like, oh man, like playing Led Zeppelin backwards or something like that. It's like, wow.
They even stole it backwards too. Those bastards.
Oh god. So anyway, I want to go back to the 1970s and just really quickly touch on a very popular book with the ruling class, a very targeted book by people in the alternative media that have recognized these, the demagogy of this book, The Limits to Growth. This was effectively the famous Club of Rome documents about population limitation, population control, stuff like that.
Pressing down on the earth.
Right. So, since they know you don't know history, because they, the ruling class has the huge inside track and the big publishers to controlling what you learned when you went through school, because it's so top down and authoritarian how they teach school, they can just dress up the same demagogy every decade or two, and then just repackage it. And now this is the most potent level of this specific brand of demagogy, which we'll trace all the way back to Malthus and maybe even further back than that, is where Malthus, the realm of demagogy in the turn of the 19th century or the beginning of the 19th century was basically write a book as a socio-political economist. That was the level of conceptualization about it, right? Thoughts of ecology, biological science didn't really exist in a kind of formalistic way yet. So you were going to make these arguments on population control, population levels, the relationship of population growth to the ecological system as an economist. But now, in the recent context, they can dress it up in so many layers of pseudo-scientific jargon and mathematic extrapolation. And, look at all these graphs. Look at the wonderful. I mean, this book has just graphs and models, just graph after graph. Look how much data we have, right?
Well, it's probably, building off the same model that Malthus would do. You create these worlds, and then sort of prove your own point through the worlds that you created. And, this one's probably more sophisticated than Malthus, so it can use some graphs and whatnot, take it really, let's take an island population. Let's look at the Easter Island people, huh? Yeah. That's always the one they like to look at. And then they chopped down all their trees, and then they were gone. Oh, no. The poor Eastern Islanders.
Right, just comparing to something that they can't really know what happened. Maybe some kind of bird flew out there, migratory bird that had some kind of larval bug on it that dropped to one of the trees and just devoured all the plant life on the...
Sure.
Yeah. It was just total speculation, right? Like, they don't know, so they might as well just pin it on, bad humanity, you done wrong.
Yep, you kept out of balance with nature, and then you are punished.
Yeah.
Or smited.
And it's like, you go over to Hawaii, and there was people living there for thousands of years, and they lived, there were trees, and they didn't chop all the trees down, right? So, anyway, that's just, like, completely selective. It's like, if you totally destroy your environment utterly, you're probably going to die, too. But that's not the dichotomy. That's not the question.
Dr. Seuss and the Lorax.
Yeah,
if that's what's going on, you're chopping down all those whatever foo-fla trees.
Yeah.
Then you're probably going to be screwed. But that's not what's happening.
Right. So you'll notice something with the ecology talk, and this goes back to Malthus. That it's total doomsday, right? So they got a lot of what I would deem the more right-wing religious types they already have you in the doomsday psychosis, where it's either induced religiously, or you look at the right-wing economists, right? Oh, there's going to be this huge financial reckoning. Peter Schiff, Ron Paul, Ragnarok of finance is right around the corner. Mm-hmm. So they're selling you this hysterical fear and end-of-world psychosis through right-wing channels. Left-wing channels, it's done through ecology, basically. That the world is dying,
sea levels
we're
rising.
Destroying it.
Hey man, I just talked with this guy the other day who was like, sea levels, that the sea levels are rising. Like, we can build walls. These are problems. Like, even if the worst scenario of global warming happens, these are all issues that, through technology and development, can be solved by people.
They just found fish bones from ancient fish, like in the Chilean, upper hills, right? Mm-hmm. So clearly that tells us, this is long before global warming, people, from anthropogenic global warming. So the Earth is constantly changing. The sea levels have been much higher, much lower. There was things I was reading about how during the Ice Age, the water levels go down so much because so much of that water is held in polar ice caps. All these land areas around Europe are accessible on the ground, where they have farms and stuff like that, on the seafloor. Now, some of these more shallow areas of the inner Baltic Sea and just other Aegean coast, things like that. So
they found that 15,000-year-old civilization in Turkey. What's it called? Göbekli Tepe. That was
on the ocean floor or something.
It was Baltic or Black Sea.
Yeah,
really know that.
So sea levels rise and fall, right? And we know historically that these things have happened without our input. Mm-hmm. So maybe we should just concern ourselves with what we can do and increasing productive powers of man that would be able to confront these things if they even weren't even caused.
Let's say we are going into 100, 200 years of we're going to have lots of huge hurricanes. Mm-hmm. We'll build some seawalls. Yeah. I mean, New York was crushed by Sandy. If that's going to happen every 5 years, then some serious development needs to happen where you have pump systems and sewer systems that can accommodate this sort of thing. The fact that you're just going to white flag and move to the hills is absolutely absurd and not going to happen.
Yeah, and you notice that with this doctrine of limits to growth and with the population bomb, which was limits to growth 10 years prior, but did not have the backing of huge oligarchical factions to make this way more statistics, way more. Oh, this is the authoritative thing. To 30 PhDs or 40 PhDs working on this pamphlet. That their solution to everything from Malthus to today is just reduce human population and everything will be great. Mm-hmm. Right? So they want genocide, or they want just a lessening of the amount of people on the planet, and that's always their go-to solution, right? Because you're talking about a class of people who are in a super privileged position by crushing labor, by depriving labor of rights, wages, rising wages, organization. You can't organize labor. And so their whole position is based on oppression. And so when a solution comes down the pike that they deem is big enough to threaten the entire boat, then it's, throw you overboard. That's their solution. Because they have no conceptualization of how to deal with any of these problems. Because all of their power is arbitrary and is actually slave power. It derives off oppressing others, crushing others to serve them. So fundamentally of themselves, they're total parasites. That's the class that promotes this kind of stuff. Anyway, so here's the introduction of this book, Limits to Growth. I do not wish to seem overdramatic, but I can only conclude from the information that is available to me as Secretary General that the members of the United Nations have perhaps 10 years left in which to subordinate their ancient quarrels and launch a global partnership to curb the arms race, to improve the human environment, to diffuse the population explosion, and to supply the required momentum to development efforts. If such a global partnership is not forged within the next decade, then I very much fear that the problems that I have mentioned will have reached such a staggering proportion that they will be beyond our capacity to control. Mr. U. Thought, 1969. What happened?
Nothing. Not anything that this guy's talked about.
All right, so doomsday, and our problems are
anyone peddling doomsday. They're probably not the answer.
Yeah, it's there's times for alarm, but those are not the average experience. Early August 2013, after the Syrian weapons false flag event, that was a time for alarm.
Absolutely.
That's get mobilized, call your representatives, send the mail, organize protests now, because that's an immediate concern. But right now, there doesn't seem to be any of those on the immediate radar. There is no move to move troops into Ukraine. There is no move to move troops into Iraq yet. Now, if that seems to be shifting, then that'll be a moment for alarm, but not as of yet. So you can't live in just a panicked state of mind. That will prevent you from learning and from developing these higher conceptualizations. That will be able to find your way out of these problems. Okay, so here's some more stuff from Limits to Growth. It is possible to alter these growth trends and to establish a condition of ecological and economic stability that is sustainable far into the future. The state of global equilibrium could be designed so that basic material needs of each person on Earth are satisfied and each person has an equal opportunity to realize his individual human potential. Okay, well, the rest of this book, without boring you with all the details, is basically constantly saying that the supply of resources is fixed, therefore they're attriting. Basically, we're deteriorating the condition of the resources. Now, what's the problem with that?
Space.
And that also that resources are not self-evident. That you don't know what a resource is until a scientific process unlocks what that is.
Yeah.
Therefore, that is not a completely known quantity. So you want to sit here and say, oh, these are global stocks of resources, and there's some hilarious tables they put in here that say, this is our supply of natural gas.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to see how big that number is now? Like 100 times higher that is than what they said it was? Mm-hmm. Because the way that they can access natural gas now is different than they used to be able to do it. So there's no solution within a world of no technological growth, and that you're going to manage the resources somehow, just in some kind of way, to not attrit. When they're already saying it's fixed. So it's just totally contradictory, right? If your supply of resources is in, and you're always reducing that, and there's no growth, and you live in a fixed system, you're doomed. So thank God we don't live in a fixed system, and that we can discover processes that tap into things that are now just worthless dirt, as coal used to be before they knew
steam power.
Yeah, exactly. Harness it to something useful. Okay, so here is maybe the best quote out of the entire book, and maybe there's just a few more here. Chapter 1. The first quote of this book, even you could just throw the book away because it just totally invalidates the entire book.
Yeah.
Which is great. The nature of exponential growth. Quote, people at present think that 5 sons are not too many, and that each son has 5 sons also. And before the death of the grandfather, there are already 25 descendants. Therefore, people are more, and wealth is less. They work hard and receive little. So who wrote that? Han Fi Su, circa 500 BC.
Wow, he's wrong by a lot.
Yeah, so this guy was talking about Malthusian conceptions of population growth 2,500 years ago, where he's saying the more people you have, the poorer you are. Where are we now? What is the population of the world 100 times higher than it used to be at this era, or even more than that? Yet we're way richer than we have ever been compared to someone living 2,500 years ago. So this was Malthus 2,300 years before Malthus. Doesn't this invalidate the entire book? Because it's saying that population growth always leads to more poverty. Yet that is not the case, clearly. From understanding just anything about history and realizing that we didn't have these technologies. What leads to prosperity? Technology, productivity, industry. That's what leads to it. So if you don't have enough people living in your society to have these higher functions by higher organizations and higher specializations of labor, then you're not going to be able to develop these technologies. So they package this up, and the rest of the book is just equally as flawed. Just basically tons of extrapolation that they pick these certain data points that they know, and then they just make up the rest of it based on extrapolation of the population doubles exponentially, and that the concentration of population, as we'll find as we move forward, is based on huge amount to do with transportation technology. Because if you can move food from the hinterlands into an inner city, then people do not have to live in such a diffuse way. But those people have to be employed, and they have to be offering those people that live in the hills or in the rural part of the land something in exchange. So they have to be organizing their labor in a sufficient way to provide that person value, so they're going to grow a surplus of food to exchange. So this is, that's how actual human societies grew up and cities grew up and things like that. It's the general sense of it. But these books do nothing to do that. So what interests are these people shielding? What are they defending by having this sophistry? In the 1970s, they were defending the continued hegemony of the American empire. And it's not too hard to prove that, right? If they're, why are they avoiding the biggest questions, right? They're talking about development in the third world, but not talking about why that development is not taking place. What is preventing it from taking place?
Imperialism.
Yeah. So there you have a modern conception of ecology. Now with Malthus, do you want to fill us in on what you found with Malthus, because you read Malthus most recently, and just the similarity of it, right?
Well, that it's just anti-historical. That's really the main thing I took from this, was that he'll create a world, a bunch of times he creates these worlds that prove his point, and then he just states how they prove his point because he created them in their own way.
Right. And it's like libertarian Austrian economics, right? You create a fictitious world.
Very narrow-minded,
and then you put some inputs into it, and then it generates your desired outcome. But you created that world that you were wanting, and you wanted that outcome. You defined the system, and so you're going to get the outcome you want. And so when he's talking about population growth, and when the Club of Rome people over at the Limits to Growth are talking about population growth, they're discussing, it's not an objective science. It's not them actually looking at reality and saying, oh, well, this is what we found. It's a political agenda pushed through a channel. Imagine the ruling class just coming out saying, we really, we improve our position and we can strengthen our position just by having enough of you dying off every, if we had 1% of the population dying off every year, how much disorganization and chaos and social upheaval and inability for people to organize in regard to what the interests of the 99% are would be so disrupted by that level of upheaval and chaos that we'd never be able to challenge ruling class power. And that's why they would want it. That would get nowhere, right? The person would be deemed like this, basketball owner of this basketball team, that was making these racist comments of how he actually thinks.
Ran out of the NBA on a $2 billion rail.
Yeah. So how these people think is disgusting. And so they're not going to say how they think. They're going to find some, crank or psychotic or lunatic or misanthrope.
Sophist
or demagogue that is in somewhat of a line of how they consider the world, and they're going to give them a little bit of money. And that person all of a sudden has this platform, or they just get access. They say, hey, my head of the media company that I own is going to interview you and talk about your book and give it rave reviews. And that's how, but that's not only going on from one person's perspective in the ruling class. That's a whole consensus of how these people think, right? So that's how these things get traction. That they're going to create false systems of science to push their agenda, and that is as old as Malthus. And even before that, that quote from 500 BC, same thing. What do you think he was defending? Do you think that was an objective view of the world? Well, how could it be? Right? And these people are repeating it as if it's true, even though we have 100 times the amount of population or more than we did back then.
Yeah, it's really all based on not looking behind the curtain.
Yeah.
If you challenge these sort of ideas at all, they fall apart in front of you. Just look at what's, the anti-historical nature of this stuff is so apparent. I mean, there's a 500,000-year-old quote in that explaining it.
Do we have any kind of quotes out of there? Is just the similarity of the language?
This is from chapter 4
of Malthus's 1802 book, an essay on the principle of population.
And it starts the chapter with the state of civilized nations. We are assured that China is the most fertile country in the world, that almost all the land is in tillage, and that a great part of it bears 2 crops every year, and further that the people live very frugally. We may infer that with certainty that the population must be immense, without busying ourselves in the inquiries into the manners and habits of the lower classes, and the encouragements to early marriages. But these inquiries are of the utmost importance, and very minute history of the customs of the lower Chinese would be the greatest use in asserting in what manner the checks to future population operate. What are the vices and what are the distresses that prevent an increased number beyond the ability of the country to support it? So he's asking, what are the checks and balances of the Chinese system? And that is a very oligarchical, top-down, feudal society that have lots of technological development, which is why they're able to grow as well as they have. The Chinese have always been at the forefront of technology in agriculture up until the 20th, 18th, 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they had that density of population at the time.
The two circumstances appear to be irreconcilable. certainly seems very little probable that the population of China is fast increasing. Every acre of land has been so long in cultivation that we can hardly conceive there is any great yearly addition to the average produce. So they're just completely discounting the advent of any sort of greater yield that you can get through, maybe steam power. This is written in the 1700s.
Yeah. So, this is before the big implementation of, like, the, steamboat and harnessing steam power for much more mechanical effects.
But post-Renaissance, so there was times that you could go, look at.
Yeah.
That you had the feudal societies, very low population, very low wealth, to the times where he's living in, which is in the Enlightenment age.
Yeah, the water wheel existed, and steam power would have just have been coming online at that time. Or actually, probably was already existed, because by the late 18-teens, 1820s, you had the steamboat. So, so what do we learn from Malthus? Basically, the world is fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. The world is absolutely fixed.
And it's a totally known quantity, too. Like, that when I say the world is fixed, obviously it's quantifiable, right? We know what the mass of the world is, right? Things like that. That's not what I'm talking about. It's as if the resources of it are totally known, and the processes which will mobilize those resources are totally ascertainable and known, and won't change. So technological growth is impossible, and everything's a zero-sum. Everything's a zero-sum game. So growth is impossible, which is, totally absurd, because he's living in an era of technological progress and industry, which, prove that wrong every day.
Yeah, he's wrong while he's writing this.
But what is this defending? Because that's like what they call Barreau. This was defending a model of population growth that is like it is today with global warming, that they have to have a means by which to explain the fact that you're being economically extracted.
Yeah.
That your labor, most of your labor power and most of your wealth creation is being siphoned right off the top of you. And if you can pin that on some kind of natural process, or saying, oh, this is just how it is, that's just nature functioning, then wow, like, you really have people by the balls, because they're not able to see who's holding them down.
The power of population is so superior to the power of earth to produce substance for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. The vices of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. They are precursors in the great army of destruction, and often finish the dreadful work themselves. But should they fail in this war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemic, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array and sweep off thousands and tens of thousands. Should success be still incomplete, gigantic, inevitable famine stalks in the rear, and with one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world. So, essentially advocating that these are all natural, war, famine, plague, pestilence, are all natural and good, like a forest fire, with the human population, that regrettable, sure, but vital to the balance of humanity and stance with the earth, and it's just simply anti-historical and not true.
Yeah, in the Population Bomb, Ilrich's book, he was especially painted giant pestilence and plagues as like the good guys. They were keeping the ecosystem in check.
Yeah.
And how dare we, increase our population? Because we're, of course, destroying the earth. Here's something. An increase of population without a proportional increase of food will evidently have the same effect in lowering the value of each man's patent. The food must necessarily be distributed in smaller quantities, and consequently a day's labor will purchase a smaller quantity of provisions. An increase in the price of provisions would raise either from an increase of population faster than the means of subsistence, or from a different distribution of the money of the society. And it goes on in the same vein. In the Population Bomb, in the 1960s, they were saying the same argument, and I compared it to an ant colony, right? Mm-hmm. The ant, let's say, like an ant colony is going to double in size, and some ant in the ant colony stupidly says, well, who's going to feed that other half of the ants? Well, they're going to feed themselves.
Yeah.
Because they can be productive. They can be made productive to do productive stuff to keep them going, right? So it's thinking that you're somehow, this increase in population, which each of themselves is capable to labor and create value, is somehow being tended to, or being this, invalid that you're having to, take care of. But if they're able to be made productive, they can take care of themselves. By 1802, they already had the poor laws. They had the workhouses in Britain. It was sufficiently an imperial society by that age. Anyway, we'll probably come back to Malthus as we move forward.
Oh, if we have to.
God forbid.
God forbid. He's quite a douche.
So, what was actually going on in this era, and one of the main people that is kind of going to narrate this era for us, among others in the modern historical books, is a counterpoint to Malthus and Ricardo. Because as empire progresses and primitively accumulates the resources of the society, the problems of poverty become greater and greater. The problems of people being unable to affect their own destiny and basically improve their own life, and the kind of apathy and nihilism that generates, were just higher and higher and higher. So the apologists for defending that system of extraction have to be bigger and bigger demagogues and bigger and bigger truth twisters in order to pacify any kind of degree of the population that they can. Mm-hmm. So you see the doctrine of it from Adam Smith to Malthus to Ricardo to future ones, Bessia, and the ones of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s.
Austrian School of Economics.
Yeah, it just gets worse.
Yeah.
As the empire,
it's kind of like what we're talking about with the ECB doing negative interest rates.
Yeah,
it's just the same thing, but more.
That it gets more extreme and more extreme to enable to perpetuate itself. It has to keep on biting off a bigger chunk of the social revenue. I like Henry Carey's one of his books, "The Past, the Present, and the Future." Mm-hmm. It's one of his middle books he wrote, or earlier books. It starts out, first chapter, "The Lesson of the Past to Present." Chapter 1, "Man and Land." Quote, "The first cultivator, the Robinson Crusoe of his day, provided, however, with a wife, has neither axe nor spade. He works alone. Population being small, land is, of course, abundant. He may select for himself without fear of his title being disputed. He is surrounded by soil possessed in the highest possible degree of qualities that fit him for yielding large returns to labor. They are, however, covered with immense trees that he cannot fell, or they are swamps he cannot drain. To pass through them, even, is attended with no small difficulty. The first is a mass of roots, stumps, decaying logs, and shrubs, with other he sinks half leg deep at every step." Just formulating a much clearer narrative that goes on and on and on throughout this book of the individual person, or the small proprietor, the subsistence peasant or farmer. There's just scraping out a living. The first agriculturist, basically, kind of model, is a lot different, right? Because you listen to libertarians that they always talk about Robinson Crusoes that live on an island that are the model for their modern system.
Yeah.
Not this is the proto-human living way back when, and how they came into more cooperation and more harmony and more collaboration with their neighbors, and the density of population increasing from this primitive state. They want to go to that primitive state as a model for modern man, which is totally
not going to work.
Not going to work.
300 million Robinson Crusoes.
Yeah, yeah. We live in a country of 330 million Robinson Crusoes all living on our own islands. Even though, everything in this room I have wasn't made by me, was purchased by people I'll never meet, and, yet had exchange with, right? So you're dealing with anything you deal with the economy, you're dealing with, world society. Anyway, on page 17, quote, "Nearly 40 years have elapsed since Mr. Ricardo communicated to the world his discovery of the nature and causes of rent, and of the law of its progress. The work by means of which it was first made known has since been the textbook of that portion of English community, who style themselves par excellence political economists, and anything short of absolute faith in its contents is regarded as heresy, worthy of excommunication, or as evident of incapacity to comprehend them, worthy only of contempt. Nevertheless, initiating in this the action of the followers of Mahomet in regard to the Quran, the professors one and all, basically just, making analogies to does that sound familiar, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, I remember being in college and talking about full employment in economics classes, and getting looks
yeah.
The hell are you doing here?
Remember Matt Bevin talking in that thing with the old guy?
Josh Bevin.
Josh Bevin talking in that old guy on the board that we covered in the previous weeks. Yeah.
Public investment, Tobin tax, Wall Street sales tax.
Full employment.
Things like that.
Yeah.
Those are like third rail of economics. You can't talk about that stuff.
Yeah. You will be...
It directly challenges the money power.
You will be excommunicated by talking about that kind of stuff. So, here, back in the days of David Ricardo, in the 1840s, 170 years ago, the exact same thing taking place. Isn't that interesting, right? But these people are not defending an academic orthodoxy that is somehow removed from existing power politics.
And if you're a Dracula-type person, you can see that. You can see, because, I was alive in the 1840s and I saw the Industrial Revolution run right up against the current economics of David Ricardo and Malthus at the time and smash them. Right. And you can see the existing demagogy around them. And you see that today with the internet, sort of being the engine of the new Industrial Revolution.
Well put. So the people with the money control the academic study of money. Yeah. This is pretty simple.
Absolutely.
And this has not changed in hundreds of years.
Full deployment.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, like what? That directly...
No, we have to have inflation.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, I like pages like that.
Yeah.
Some pages are... It's like a book that's a scan, so you get... They even like cut out pages. They're just blank pages over here.
Redacted.
Yeah. Anyway, so he lays out Ricardo's doctrine. So David Ricardo's doctrine, some of it's missing because it's a really old book, so the scan is kind of crappy. But anyway, Ricardo's fifth law, basically.
The iron law of wages.
Yeah. Talking about David Ricardo's fifth law. That this tendency towards diminution in the return of labor and towards an increase of the landlord's proportion always exists where population increases, and most exists where population increases most rapidly. But it is, in a certain degree, counteracted by the increase of wealth, producing improvement of cultivation. Sixth, that every such improvement...
See, they'll in the same breath, they'll completely blow up their argument as an aside.
Like, that's always the truth, except when it isn't.
In these obvious cases.
Yeah, it's a law. So I want to imply that being the case in cases where it isn't. So in this era of the 1840s, and even prior to that, the 1688, basically dominance of the English Revolution and basically England becoming an imperial force on the planet. Mm-hmm. What was
collapse of the Spanish Empire?
The collapse of the Spanish Empire, the French being knocked out after Napoleon, is that after the this period of hegemony by the British, of what they're talking.
Pax Britannia.
Yeah, from the close of Waterloo to the
World War One.
Yeah, definitely. But it does change in character during that time. But definitely that is the era. Going to blows. Okay, we have to have a duel.
Yeah.
We're gonna go duel outside. Anyway, what was their threat of increasing populations in other countries? And why did they have to have all this, elaborate social theories to explain all this stuff and to say that you shouldn't want these things, that population growth is bad, that you should not want to increase in population because it's going to deplete the soils and destroy your, this and that, and just any excuse they could come up with, right? It's because that any other place that could increase population by industrialization, because it's not the inverse. You don't get an increase in population and then you get industrialization. You have industrialization which increases population, which is something that Adam Smith completely reversed. That was his population growth theory that he reversed to make it seem like the opposite, to still hide these same factors. By that time, so his writing in 1776, the British had already been an imperial force for 100 years, right? So he was defending the same interests that these guys were, except that that the language was more academic, and that these guys were writing for a stupider audience, basically. Is how it goes.
Blow up Adam Smith's argument to compare it with the history of the railroad and what that did.
Anyway, so if you could do that, though, you would get an increase in population that would reciprocate with more increases in industry when you were able to cultivate that. But then that's what that's what rival powers came from. That they didn't want anyone else growing up to have any strength, any authority to potentially challenge them. Look at how they're threatened by China now. Same thing. That they're growing in population, they're growing in wealth. Back then, to grow in population was to grow in wealth, because you had to have a increase of population enough to conduct an industrial society, and you could not do that with a very meager population just thinly spread across the hillside. You had to have cities, And so anyway, his sixth law, to continue, that every such improvement tends to retard the growth of rents, while every obstacle to improvement tends to increase that growth, and that therefore the interest of the landowner and laborer are always opposed to each other, rents rising as labor falls and vice versa. So he is central to this, is trying to conduct basically, gin up basically that the only social conflict that exists in society is between people that own land and the people that don't own land.
Yeah, renters.
So exactly what Evan was saying earlier, that Ricardo represented the new moneyed, the nouveau rich of the industrialists and financiers,
the Roundheads,
against the landed aristocracy,
the royalists.
And so his whole doctrine is creating an orientation towards creating class warfare, but totally making the capitalist class, the financier class, basically, and the biggest, when I say capitalist class in this context, I mean the industrial capitalists, just erasing them from the scenario. Mm-hmm. Right? So the self-interestedness of it is fairly evident. It goes on, Ricardo's theory is completely zero-sum game. That, and the crux of this book, Henry Charles Carey's book, The Past, Present, and Future, is targeting that Ricardo's worldview is completely zero-sum, and is completely backwards from how land use actually comes into cultivation.
Absolutely.
So he says Ricardo's theory is that man, when he first goes to be a cultivator, moves directly into the areas that are the most fertile, and then therefore, as population increases, has to move into less fertile areas, even though that's exactly the opposite. They move into less... The thing is, the fertile areas are taken. Nature takes those. A swamp is very fertile, but it's fertile because nature is already there. Nature beat you to the punch. Sorry. Like your cute idea of cultivating, the plant life has been there for millennia.
Yeah.
So it's already been there, and for you to do something about that, for you to fell large trees that take up these lowlands, to drain swamps, that takes, look at the Romans drained swamps, marshes. That takes infrastructure. That takes water projects. So that is inaccessible to the individual farmer, the individual cultivator to do, because you need a huge organized society to do these kind of projects. So
the big flaw with sort of Robinson Crusoe libertarian thought is that the sort of reality of human life runs in direct contradiction with their sort of fantasy, Robinson Crusoe ideas. And the real problem with libertarianism is that it has some valid points if you're looking at yourself as an individual. Mm-hmm. If you really want to be self-reliant, if you really want to do those things like balance your own budget, those are all good things, but then when you try to apply them to societies and keep the same laws, they're absolutely flawed.
Yeah. What should be the orientation of society? These questions need to be answered, because if you don't answer them, they'll be answered by the financier class, and their answers are not pretty. War, austerity, things trending towards genocide. That's what they do. Mm-hmm. It's not pleasant to talk about or think about, but hey, that's just laid out here for you in these books of Ricardo pushing the same kind of doctrine, Malthus pushing the same kind of doctrine.
Yeah, this is a quote from Ricardo from the Iron Law of Wages. Is that notwithstanding the tendencies of wages to conform to their natural rate, their market rate may, in an improving society, for an indefinite period, be consistently above, for no sooner may the impulse which an increased capital gives to a new demand for labor, then another increase of capital may produce the same effect. Thus, if the increase of capital be gradual and constant, the demand for labor may give a continuing stimulus to the increase of people. So, completely, when wages conform to their natural rate, as if wages, that these is sort of universal law, that's why it's Iron Law of Wages, that they conform to their market rates without mentioning the crushing of labor, the inability to organize, and these sort of senses, and the productive capacity of each worker being, the main fruits are being siphoned off by a ruling class.
Yeah, and Smith had the same thing, where he says they always lean on saying this is natural.
Yeah.
Yet having a legal entity as a corporation is artificial. So yet the rules of what is selected is natural and not natural is totally arbitrary.
Well, they'll take it
completely biased for their interests.
To sort of like they always like to do the hunter-gatherer. If I make baskets and you gather berries, and we come to this sort of conclusion of what baskets versus berries are worth in this free market model, which is
as if the owner class just doesn't exist.
Yeah, and it's anti-historical, and
the
very
manager
simple.
Class doesn't exist either.
They'll use very simple models to explain very complex things.
Yeah, everyone's a sole proprietor. Large organizations, aggregations, industries, corporations don't exist. The rentier class doesn't exist. There's no financial class that sits on top of those industrial classes that exist. And you're just doing individual exchanges with a bunch of, people that are just all making everything, out of their 3D printer or whatever, or their, steampunk fantasy. So you see with Ricardo, and the point of the iron law of wages is basically that wages will be always going down,
always as low as possible.
Yeah. Always, they're trending to subsistence levels. Was what Ricardo says. Ricardo speaks in such a completely sophistical way. It's really hard to follow what he's saying. It's even worse than Malthus, way worse. And so, the iron law of wages in the modern context too is that wages always go down to the lowest level of subsistence, and that's their natural place to be.
And you should only invest, like he has a thing called competitive advantage, in your systems that you have this competitive advantage of naturally, of course. You can't develop anything.
Right. Yeah. They like to compare it to the French wine growers, and they're like, if you tried to grow, wine in Iceland, like that wouldn't work. But yet we're not talking about cultivation and agriculture. We're talking about industry, right? So look at Japan, right? Saying that you can't be industrial here. You don't have any natural resources. Yet Japan is a huge industrial superpower. Why is that? Well, because they invested in their people, and they invested in technology, and they embraced technology and technological change to improve their people. And so it's just like what you want to do. And, with that you see, like what Evan said before, that the iron law of wages, that his theory on rentiers basically focuses all the social angst at the landed aristocracy, and then also provides a smokescreen for what the financier class and the capitalist class wanted at the time, which is a depression of wages. Yeah. And an explanation to say that this is natural, or this is like what is natural, or just this is what's ordained by the system, that wages will go down to the lowest level. Well, yeah, if you prevent British labor from organizing, which they did, and they would kill people that tried to organize unions, that's what you get. But, the position of the corporation is equally as artificial as a labor union. So, why does one have preference and one does not have preference? Oh, because, of course, the concentration of wealth and power is historically the constant. That there's always a 1%, basically. And they largely run the society. And, the brief eras of progress in human development come out of resisting that 1%, typically.
Yeah, Pericles in Athens. New Deal America.
Yeah, because they're not interested in any kind of thing, future orientation or future trajectory. They're doing great.
Yeah,
they're always looking. They're always clinging, like a cat being dragged to the bathtub, just like claws digging into the ground against modernization, against future orientation, against progress, against human progress.
And you can see it in the media today with the over romanticism of the '60s. That we have going on in our own culture.
Yeah.
I mean, how many things about the '60s are we going to have to endure? I mean, sure, Mad Men's great, but CNN just had a thing about the '60s, the decade that changed America.
Yeah.
How about the current decade that we're in right now? How about the next decade, the 2020s? I mean, what's 2018 going to look like if we continue down this path that we're on right now of no internal development?
Yeah, exactly. Even in other books we'll maybe touch on later, that the backward-lookingness is in this era too. Is to be found in this era as well.
Absolutely.
Saying they had it figured out 50 years ago. Man, if we could just go back then, everything would be fine.
Yep.
Selectively picking out, the good parts, right? Now, if you look at the 1960s, there's great things going on, music and whatever.
Space exploration.
Yeah, and then you look at the bad things, the racism,
if you're a woman.
Yeah.
Sexism.
Yeah, just the other social things that are overcoming. So, point is, every generation has to deal with their shit. Rather than trying to go backward, why don't we just deal with the problems that we have? Rather than wishing for some place that we can never return to. That'll be the next moonshot. Build a time machine so we can go back to the 1950s.
Yeah.
We're looking forward and back. Everybody wins.
That would be cool. Time machine. That's cool. It's I was kind of on the side. I was thinking about. I keep on hearing from people like Tarpley that convert the military-industrial complex to scientific development. I was thinking, keep Halliburton and Raytheon's contracts the same, but just change it instead of, building Abrams tanks. We want 500 new space shuttles of the newest quality. We want 15 cities to be able to launch them from. We want moon colony, Mars colony, outer space mining operations, exploration, exploration of the oceans. Get GE to build some submarines that can go down to the deepest depths of the ocean and do samples and see what's down there. Yeah. See what resources are still available to be used in order to reach the stars, which is our natural destiny.
Right. That kind of orientation is what we need to get us out of this problem. And to turn those social forces of all those companies that you just mentioned, Raytheon, GE, Halliburton, Caterpillar, to something that's useful.
Yeah. Because
they own cutting-edge technological processes and industrial processes that they own and develop and have all the best minds working on. So let's put those to use for actually humanity's betterment rather than serve. Right now, those forces are basically imperial because they're serving the interest of the money power of this country. And so, their character can change, though. The rank and file of those companies are just people doing jobs. What direction they're pointing in is something that they're kind of just, adrift in the ocean and can't really control unless we want to have an orientation in that direction. It requires, like I said in the very beginning, increasing our conceptual, our understanding and our conceptualizations have to be beyond they can't be resolved in your own lifetime's experience. You're going to have to learn history. And luckily we have, done a lot of the grunt work of pointing people in a decent direction of it, because it's just how much continually masking of what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And you see it historically, right? That they're apostates of the economic academics will be outcast.
Yeah, look at Ron Chernoff's book on George Washington. Doesn't mention at all his terms in presidency and the economic developments that he did. The Erie Canal, he's barely mentioned. And
he liked to dance, though.
He certainly he did like to dance.
Man, he loved women.
Yep.
That's what I learned from that book. A 1,200-page book on Washington. And it's really great. It's a great book until you get to the first term of the presidency. Because then the character of how they're describing Washington just disappears. Because he goes from being a fierce patriot to just this administrator, right, with no direction, orientation, future orientation to the population. 500
pages breaking down his relationship with his mom.
So that's what they're left to, right? Because they can't talk about these things because the oligarchy would be ticked. So anyway, the theory of this book of The Past, the Present, and the Future by Henry Charles Carey is that he's following population growth through Delaware and
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, he's talking about Sweden. The thing is, he's talking about actual places that actually exist.
Yep.
And following
not Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah, and what happened? Yeah. He originally talks about a theoretical Robinson Crusoe as if someone that had, as a thought experiment for someone that lived a long time ago. Yeah, unless you're talking about the floodplain of Egypt or something like that. That this model that Carey is talking about is the model. It was different in those areas of
Fertile Crescent.
The Fertile Crescent, because you would basically have a flood season that would bring up useful soils, till them up basically, and put them on the shore, and then you could farm with that, and it was a huge boon to those civilizations at the time. But for people living in the more Nordic climates, or just not living in a desert with this kind of accessibility, the model followed this. Starting from this later point and tracing the course of settlement, we find that it not at first extending downwards towards the rich meadowlands, but upwards along the ridge between the two rivers, where the village of Germantown, which half a century since exceeded 3 miles in length, and was for a village very closely built, remains to mark the tendencies of early colonialists. If now we pass right or left to the river banks, we shall see, in the character of the buildings, evidences of later occupation and cultivation. If further evidence be desired, we look to the maps of the early day, and we find the fertile lands in the vicinity of the Delaware, from Newcastle, almost to the head of the Tidewater, at a distance of more than 60 miles, marked as held in large tracts, dotted over with trees, to show that they are still uncleared, while the upper lands are divided into small farms. Passing northward and westward, and keeping near the river, we see the oldest habitations always the most distant from the river, but later times, an increase of population and wealth, have carried cultivation down to the water's edge. So that in direct opposition to Ricardo's theory, that historically, when you look at it, that cultivation starts in the, minus the floodplain of Egypt and Iraq, ancient Iraq and Syria and places like that, that exists in the upper hills first, because the soils are thin and the trees are not covering the area. So you can grow crops in the clearings up in the hills.
Meadows and such.
Yeah, the meadows and things like that. Clearings, rock slide happened, and therefore there's a clear spot of land in which you can actually grow. It's not covered with forest. There's not a swamp, right? So it doesn't have these things that you need an axe, you need metallurgy, you need,
Research metallurgy.
Research metallurgy, right? Invest 10 points into metallurgy, to build an axe, to build a saw that are able to fell these trees. With your hands, maybe you can take the bark off of it, but even if you're able to kill the tree, it's physically going to be there, and that's that's just impossible.
Burn it, maybe.
Yeah, you could burn it. It's still going to be there though. Large trees, unless you'd be burning the bark off of a tree basically. Anyway, so that you need collaboration of people in order to create industry, in order to fell these trees, in order for humanity to move into the lowlands and further increase the population. So that's Ricardo and Malthus basically in a nutshell.
Well, I would like to give some context historically for what was going on.
Yeah, please.
At the tail end of the sort of kingship age of the world, I mean, this is after the English Civil War, before the American Revolution, during the American Revolution, and before the French Revolution, which is what really sort of set this stuff off as the dominant thoughts of the victory of the British over Napoleonic stuff in 1815. Mm-hmm. Is really what put this on top. And then you have a British hegemony power in Europe, and therefore essentially the rest of the world with their large navy forces that they had built up after. Think about America right after World War II. That's what Great Britain was after the Napoleonic Wars. Sort of colossus astride the world. And what they were trying to do was expand. They had their crown jewel of colonial property in India at this time, which they were cultivating opium out of, and trying to get into China was really what they were trying to do. And this time would be exemplified by the Opium Wars, first Opium War in 1842. What was going on in America at this time, you had lots of Democrat, sort of Jeffersonian radicals in the presidency, but Whigs running Congress. So you had a lot of internal improvements happening in the United States, creating all this wealth in this country that was mainly excluded in the South due to their own Jeffersonian radicalist nature, their suspicion of modern technology.
When he says Jeffersonian too, it's more idealized Jefferson and like what he wrote than kind of the presidency of Jefferson.
Yeah, well, the presidency of Jefferson was deeply flawed and disastrous almost, with the destruction of the U.S. Navy.
Yeah,
and the dealings with
near destruction.
Destruction of the U.S. Navy. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase is sort of the shining star of that.
Yeah,
but then again, I mean that
Lewis and Clark, maybe
Lewis and Clark too. Yeah. Up here in Portland, can't talk about this. Always got to talk about Lewis and Clark.
Thank you, Jefferson, for sending Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark to Oregon. The Whig Party also is really relevant to cover.
Keep holding it to the microphone.
Yeah. There you go.
You can see it.
Yeah, can you see this? Can you see the Whig book where I'm holding it from? It's really interesting and it's very comparable to the modern context because we're looking at a model of how political parties collapse. And in this era, actually, that we're talking about, 1830s to 1860, basically, is that two parties collapse, actually, in this time frame. So it's even more of a good, rich source to see what is presently going on with the Republican Party and the Democratic Party.
Democrats.
Because either of these could collapse.
Both are going to collapse, I think.
Yeah, and they better, like I said before. They better collapse, or else the United States is going to collapse. It's either like you or us or them. They got to go. They're too corrupt. They're too totally comfortable, sold out. They don't represent the American people. They're totally incompetent. The total, malfeasance and nonfeasance of these things is just at a fever pitch. Yeah. And we can't have them continuing to dominate the society. It's just not going to work.
You can see it in their chosen presidential candidate for 2016, Hillary Clinton versus Jeb Bush.
Yeah.
I mean,
Our dark horse, Ben Sass.
Sure. I still think Bush is the...
Mm-hmm. He's definitely the old boys network mobilization.
funny it was you, and all you wanted was me. A sorrow flow, it's the silent rise of the machine.
So now that we're getting into more of the historical meat of things rather than just, beating up on Peter Schiff as, what our show is here.
Yeah.
And,
although I think we could beat up on him some more. He's pretty despicable.
Yeah, he deserves to be beaten up at every opportunity. But anyway, we're getting into some more meaty kind of stuff here. The source material that's making up this kind of analysis is The Rise and Fall of the American Whig Party, Jacksonian Politics, and the Onset of the Civil War by Michael F. Holt, written in, I believe this one was written in 1999.
Yeah, and I have a Wicked War, Polk, Lincoln, and Clay by Amy S. Greenberg, which talks about the Mexican-American War.
Mm-hmm. We have The Past, the Present, and the Future by Henry Charles Carey, written originally in 1840s. I don't remember what date. It's not really that important when it's that far
I think
back.
it's 48, actually.
48?
It was the year of the
Okay.
Mexican-American War. Also, I've been using Professor David Blight's lecture series on the Civil War, 1840 to 1871. It's free online. I highly recommend it. It's one of the best lecture series on the Civil War. It doesn't do anything of the foreign policy aspect that you can get from Tarpley
Yeah.
if you want.
The original essay on the principle of population by T.R. Malthus was written, I think, in 1802, but he kept re-releasing it and adding lots more content over the next 10 years. So,
Also,
The Limits to Growth was written in This is the neo-Malthusianism in 1972.
Also pulling off of the 30 Years' War by C.V. Wedgwood, is something I'm pulling from, as well as Ron Chernoff's Washington of Life, Ron Chernoff's Alexander Hamilton, The First Tycoon about Vanderbilt was T.J. Stiles I'm pulling from, because it's a lot to do with sort of growth of America from 1800 to 1870. Because Vanderbilt was a quintessential, essentially the capstone of that entire economic movement was Cornelius Vanderbilt. And also A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, which is about the 14th century, which is where I pull a lot of information from the feudal societies and how it relates to people like Malthus and Ricardo and their servitude to the sort of feudal oligarchies that have to deal with the emerging world of the Enlightenment and in the Industrial Revolution, and how Malthus and Ricardo facilitate their dominance continuing into these new sort of social dynamics.
Ricardo's book, The Principles of a Political Economy and Taxation.
Fateful Lightning, A New History of the Civil War and Reconstruction by Alan C.
We also have a book called, when we start getting into the actual, day-to-day run-up in this, book called The Impending Crisis, America Before the Civil War, 1848 to 1861 by David M. Potter. Pretty good book. I like that one a lot so far.
All the King's Men by Robert Warren. Something I just finished. It's about Huey Long, but a lot of the sort of libertarian Calvinist theology is in it that you get someone like the guy who beat Cantor. He's very Calvinist.
Dave Bratt.
Dave Bratt. And then The Divide by Matt Taibbi.
Throwing everything in.
Why not? Let's just. What am I reading?
The Union and Liberty, the Political Philosophy of John C. Calhoun. The New York Times Complete Civil War Compendium. And The Political Culture of the American Whigs by Daniel Walker Howe. These are the books that we're basing or using to conceptualize and understand this era. And just also stuff we're reading in general.
Paris Commune of 1871, which I thoroughly destroyed, this copy of this book.
You read it so hard it just blew up.
I just ripped it apart. It's bad.
It just detonated.
Well, the Paris Commune is a really tragic story. They could never get a unity government going. They fought each other. They got some victories. They took the city, and then they were able to defeat the Prussian forces as well as the Royalist forces. And then they just fought amongst themselves until they were surrounded, and now they're just at this sort of glorious last stand on the barricades, getting cannoned and put up against a wall. But they did get a lot of reforms through, lasting reforms, which is sort of the history of the French reform movement, is that they'll get a revolution that'll be very high-minded and very far-reaching, and then it'll get destroyed. But it'll get a little bit of progress from those reforms, and then the monarchy will rise again.
Concessions, yeah.
Concessions and back and forth.
Right, and to see this stuff is kind of universal, because what goes on in France affects what's happening in the United States and what's happening in Britain and everything.
I think a good model is looking at France compared to the United States.
Yeah, right across the pond. We're even looking at the concessions made to the British people post-Civil War. The universal suffrage came out of that. and other social reforms because they had to make concessions, because their schemes didn't work, and then were able to create a slave empire stretching all the way to South America. And so to quell domestic tension, that they take these approaches of making concessions to get steam out of the pot. Basically, let's relieve some pressure.
Yeah, and that pressure release has been a fundamental aspect of politics for a long time. Like if you read Barbara Tuchman's book on the 14th century, one of the pressure releases were these pogroms against Jewish populations.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so these pressure releases have always been very important.
Yeah. Scapegoat a minority. That's always the banker's go-to method.
Or Tea Party. Just blame Mexicans.
Yeah.
For stealing your jobs.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to do like a run-up to 1840.
Sure.
So you have Jefferson and Madison, 1800 to 1816.
Mm-hmm.
If War of 1812, which was a disaster for the United States, if not for Napoleon sort of pressure he kept on the British,
there
would have been a completely different outcome, possibly a reabsorption of America into the British Empire, almost completely, due to the disastrous policies of Jefferson and Madison.
At least surrender under very unfavorable terms, Like, surrender under the terms of, like, you will not have tariffs. Mm-hmm. You'll be a new Portugal, basically, something like that.
Yeah.
And so you look at the Monroe presidency and the John Quincy Adams presidency, and even the tail end of the Madison presidency as reactions to national disaster. That, like when you had the Civil War and you had Reconstruction, or you had World War II and the post-New Deal era. That these eras of have backlash from disaster or anything like that, and progress has to be pursued as a national interest, just of self-survival. And that's what you had with the tail end of Madison and the rising of the the Warhawks, Henry Clay at that time, and Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun in his good years, when they're pro-nationalist, pro-economic development coalition party, really, between the Southern interests and the Northern interests and the New England interests, all pretty much on the same page of what economic policy should be.
Yeah, which is all grown out of Washington's first term of economic development, canals, roadways, turnpikes, all this sort of stuff. The connection, you have the growth of the cities, bringing, raw materials, finding them in some sort of way, and then bringing them to market, which all benefited the South, the slave South, and the New England shop workers, which were all benefited from the movement of goods brought about by these internal developments paid for by public credit. Also Hamilton economics, Washingtonian economics, also John Adams, can't forget him, or else he'll turn again on his grave. Always got to mention John Adams.
He'll actually speed up.
He spins every 15 minutes. Yeah. He's so upset.
He rotates, yeah. So.
Poor joke, John Adams.
Yeah.
Why doesn't
You can also follow this in a really interesting way, which this Whig book, The American Whig Party, it's huge. This guy spent 22 years of his life writing this book, and it's like 1,200 pages.
It's like Victor Hugo.
Yeah, it's massive. It's really incredibly detailed, of just tracking the Whig Party, how it was created. The interesting parallel of this book, even from just getting into the first couple of hundred pages of it, is that I saw this really interesting commonality of political parties, where you had the original foundation of the country with the quote-unquote Federalist Party, which was really not even really an organized political institution. It was just the consensus of the post-foundation of the country was like a coalition government, where you had a commonality of understanding of what the interests of the government were.
War veterans and economic development essentially made up that whole thing.
It was people on the same page. There was detractors, Jefferson, Madison leading the opposition. They come into power. They largely are against the quote elitist quote. They always was using the word elitism. So they were targeting the elitism of Alexander Hamilton and crew. The thing is, they then tried their politics and socioeconomic policies in opposition to Hamilton, and then found that they didn't work at all, and created a huge disaster of the embargo under Jefferson,
1807,
and the huge disaster of the Madisonian presidency leading into the War of 1812, which we were so ill prepared for because of Albert Gallatin economic policies, free trade and no tariff, all this kind of stuff. That was a disaster, and so you had a reaction of that, of the Warhawks or the Henry Clays, Calhouns, and then that fully consolidated under Monroe, who had 2 terms in presidency, with John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, running a lot of the policy. John Quincy Adams gets in there for 1 term, and that his term was a kind of like an almost Obama-esque term in terms of the amount of gridlock, because by that time there was another reaction against that second wave of development. And that was codified in Jackson. And so the thing is, when you have a development party, it creates all this prosperity and this economic growth, and then there's a reaction against that from other aspects of the ruling class or other entrenched interests that are threatened by that growth and that industrialization.
Think of Nixon in the post-New Deal era. He was part of the first anti-New Deal president we had. Sort of using all the wealth that the New Deal created to try to destroy those policies in order to keep the ruling class's hegemony.
The immediacy of the collapse of the quote-unquote Federalist Party, and then later the Democratic Republicans, is of the party of Jefferson, basically, the second party system. And then also the collapse of the Whigs later on is because none of these interests had the political strength to target the biggest social force at the time, which was the Southern holding slave oligarchs. Mm-hmm. And so it was all the politics was manipulated around not targeting this most immediate issue in the society.
Yeah, it's even in the Constitution. We're going to talk about this in 20 years.
You
can't kick the can on that one.
Yeah, and a lot of the classical humanist sentiment of the foundation of the country was codified in restricting the slave trade. That there would be a certain window of time, and then the slave trade would be closed. So basically, you could not import slaves any further.
South Carolina Compromise, correct?
I think so. Yeah. And so you had these bad things of the 3/5 law, but there was humanism basically won the compromise. But as slavery as an economic system was a system of economic extraction, where basically you're creating no labor value because your labor is free, and you're actually crushing labor in any areas in which you are operating. Wages are a lot lower because if human labor is free, then obviously the people that are free aren't going to be paid that much. Okay, so I guess I can't even pick this book up with like a harness and like a back brace.
The Iron Monster.
Yeah. So the quote from American Whig Party. Quote, this is the preface of the book, I knew as I envisioned the book that these 5 goals constituted an ambitious agenda. When I began research on the Whigs, I was most interested in answering a single perplexing question. Why did the Whig Party die as a competitive political organization? My previous studies of the antebellum Republican Party and of the Know-Nothings convinced me how pivotal the death of the Whigs was to the chain of political developments that triggered the Southern secession and the subsequent Civil War. For that reason alone, accounting for the party's demise is of vital importance. Like I've said months ago before reading this book, either the Republican or the Democrat Party will collapse, or the country will collapse. That we cannot sustain a duopoly party, a cartel party system ran by and for Wall Street. It is physically breaking down. This is the key, right? And he's talking about, yes, the Whigs collapsed, and that was integral for the onset of the Civil War. And it's right. He's right.
Yep.
So we're in the same kind of parallel right now, where, the Republican Party needs to be smashed into a million pieces. And therefore, the populist, economically wing of the party, of the Democrats, can break off and become the new left-wing party, where the Democratic Party will become the new right-wing party. Basically shifting the economic goalposts way back to the left, as we've been just pulled continuously in the favor of Wall Street for the past, how
Nixon.
Since, even prior to Nixon, maybe, even like Eisenhower or something, like the last infrastructure president of any kind of real sense, right? So in that era, right? Same thing with the collapse of the Federalist Party, the collapse of the Republican Democratic Party, the party of Jefferson, the collapse of the Whig Party. These parties all collapsed because they didn't have the sufficient strength and organization to fight the slave power. the radical Republican Party of 1856, being born out of the ashes of the Whig Party and other social elements too, not even just movements. Just not even just the Whigs, but the other elements were finally confronting the actual problem of the society and the power dynamics of the society, how they were all shifted in this arbitrary way that could not be sustained anymore. Okay, here to continue that same paragraph. Why, I ask myself, have the modern Democratic and Republican parties endured for so long when virtually every index of public opinion, from polling data to low voter turnout, suggests that Americans loathe or ignore them, whereas the Whig Party, which helped generate historically high levels of voter turnout, which engendered truly passionate loyalty from voters and leaders alike, and which, I confess, people genuinely admired it, ceased to exist? How could such an anomaly, indeed, from my perspective, such an injustice occur? Well, like Evan said, they weren't able to tackle the biggest question at the time, which is slavery.
Well, the Whig Party was sort of the party. I'd see them as sort of like the modern Democrats.
Yeah,
is that they can straddle issues, and then finally there was an issue they couldn't straddle anymore, and it split them, and so the part that was pro-slavery went towards the Confederate side, and the part that was anti-slavery went to the radical Republicans under Lincoln.
Yeah.
And they just could not... Like, Henry Clay, for all his brilliance, was really... I don't know, he's a man of his times. He could never deal with slavery. It was such a difficult option for him to deal with.
Well, and also I look about the Whig Party is that fundamentally the social resistance and organization in opposition of the slave power was not sufficient enough for them to actually have a political conflict with the slaves and be victorious. Because if you're looking at the technological advance of the 1830s compared to the 1860s and the density of population in the cities, which would be able to provide a counterweight to the slave power, is that you didn't have that in this earlier time. You couldn't even talk about slavery in the Congress. It was like banned from even being discussed because that's how powerful it was. Like you can't talk about full employment nowadays.
Yeah.
You can't talk about infrastructure projects. You can't even, God help you if you talk about a Wall Street sales tax.
Jesus.
You are ostracized. So that is, the power is revealed by what it can't be talked about in the existing context, right? That's the thing that's governing what's going on. What's not discussed, So, same thing with now.
Yeah, if there was a Democratic congressman from wherever, sort of like full employment became that person's rallying cry, that person could have a huge potential for upward mobility because it's such a needed thing. Just like in the Whig Party, if there was someone really anti-slavery person, such as Lincoln wasn't that anti-slavery at the time, but someone like that coming out could certainly catapult themselves into the next level.
Yeah, and you see that with Dave Bratt,
Yeah, absolutely.
That with people targeting, that finally able to break the stigma and the sacred cow of discussing what actually is the biggest problem facing society. It's not your fantastic abstractions of the state, dear libertarians. It's not, global warming or the polar bears or any of these other social issues. It's Wall Street. That is the enemy, and whose continued misrule is going to lead to disasters for this country unless we talk about it.
Yeah.
So to continue, yet that self-conscious... Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about Henry Clay, so I want to read that. First, for both strategic and principled reasons, the Whig Party formed behind an ideological mission. Genuinely appalled by Andrew Jackson's Caesarism, by basically his flagrant refusal to follow the laws, by his apparently flagrant contempt for the separation of powers and rule of law, and contempt of that, the early Whigs believed that it threatened the people's political freedom. The party's founder tried to rally politicians and voters behind a crusade to save the revolutionary experiment in Republican self-government, or in Henry Clay's words, quote, to rescue public liberty. Yeah, so the Whig Party was born out of a resistance to Andrew Jackson. It was the kind of a legal initial platform plank was basically a legalistic argument of Jackson's flagrantly violating the laws of this country, and they were right. But of course, like the Whig Party itself was not a abolitionist party or anti-slavery party.
No, they were characterized by tariffs and internal developments is really what the Whig Party's battle cry was at the time.
Right. So they did have economic aspects about them, like the modern Democrats, which are opposed in principle to the slave power, or in modern context, to Wall Street.
Yep.
So if you're fighting usury, or you want to give student loans, offer student loans to the population, that cuts into the money power's profits. So, like, if being on that side of that issue, you are riling the biggest forces that exist, but you're not doing it directly. It's an indirect thing, and so like that's why they're largely steamrolled up until recently, where this stuff started to get much more traction. To continue, many Whig activists always cherished this mission, as they clung tenaciously to the very name Whig because of its association with the revolutionary founders. Yet that self-conscious devotion to bedrock Republican principles clearly had decided limitations in terms of arousing voters' interest or helping Whigs win office. Instead, many voters responded positively to the party only when it developed a distinctive agenda on more concrete matters of public policy. Thus, only after the Depression following the Panic of 1837 gave salience to a Republican principle embraced by Whigs, that the Commonwealth tradition of using the state actively for the benefit of the people, did Whigs succeed in mobilizing enough voter support to become truly competitive with the Democrats.
Yeah.
Populist economics is what it's meaning. That's what it's talking about. So all the, talking about legalism, talking about Jackson's violation of the laws, yes, right, of course. But, that is a weak position to be in compared to I'm going to put bread on your table as an economic policy. Not that I'm going to give you opportunity to put bread on your own table, and so forth, and so forth. That we can change the economic landscape if we want. So this book follows Henry Clay, which is a major figure of the time.
Yeah.
At the same time, no other Whig leader had suffered so many mortifying setbacks as Henry Clay, during and even before the Whigs' oft-times losing crusades against the Democratic foes. Although the Whigs' chief congressional spokesman, he had been bypassed for the presidential nomination in both 1836 and 1840 on the grounds of, quote, unavailability. When Whigs won power in the later year and had a splendid chance to enact a sweeping legislative program, Clay had done the most to formulate. A cruel twist of fate deprived him of the opportunity. In 1844, therefore, circumstances seemed to offer Henry Clay long overdue personal vindication and his party long overdue dominance. This prospect of atonement generated Whigs' religious language and euphoria. So you look at the history of the Whig Party. It's a party of calamity, defeat, failure. What else would you say? Pathetic weakness.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah, tons of that.
Some great speakers and a lot of lost promise, I would say, with the Whigs. It's sort of unfulfilled. I mean, Henry Clay probably should have been president. Webster should have had a run as well. They were never able really to get there due to sort of the demographics of the day. The Jacksonian, sort of Jeffersonian populist demagogy could always win in a much more rural society than the Whigs, even though what they offered is what the people that were voting for the Jacksonian and Jeffersonian Democrats
professed to want.
Yeah, they wanted. I mean, the canals, the turnpikes, the markets, the bringing of all the wealth that was created. Those are all Federalist and then Whig, creations.
Right.
But
so imagine too, of just what the political parties were offering to the slave oligarchy.
Well, the slave oligarchy was in charge of lots of political parties, and they really shaped the message of a lot of the political parties. And so the rank and file, if you're in Kentucky in 1840, you're being inundated with pro-slavery, anti-Whig, anti-development, anti-modern propaganda.
Yeah.
it being, touted as a freedom and liberty of what you hear today from regular libertarians of this soaring rhetoric of like we're all we're all a new atom in this world and we can create our own way.
I think a big part of it too was when you look at the Lincoln movie that came out in the past year or whatever with Tommy Lee Jones and
D-Day, Daniel
Day-Lewis, yeah. There was a big contingent of people in the Congress, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, the Breckinridge Democrats. They basically, they broke off and formed the other government. And the Whigs too, or what was formerly Whig.
Southern
Whigs were total slave, totally bigger slave mongers than even the Southern Democrats. It was like Bernie Sanders or something like that with putting the poll of let's bomb Russia on his website. He's saying that since I'm an opposition candidate and since I'm so critical of this mainstay thing, I got to get some clout and inroad by being a warmonger. And in the sense of the Southern Whigs, they're bigger slaveocrats than even the Democrats down there, the old Democratic Party, of course. So it's kind of like the handmaidens of Wall Street nowadays, right? The Republicans and the Democrats are both saying I can do your bidding better. The Obama file nature, the de Blasios of New York. It's all kind of we're going to pretend to be left and have
social issues of gay marriage and immigration reform.
Yeah, just in a few economic scraps. I can throw you a few scraps here and there.
Preschool.
Yeah, free school funding. Wow,
which is important and incredibly. It should be a national interest.
Yeah, it's crumbs off the table though. So to make that acceptable, it's just not dignified. So, but that's how they do it, right? So it's hammering on social issues, and then a little bit of red meat for the economic issues, while pretending to be railing against that force. So that's what they offer. And the Whig Party, too, was more of a coalition party where you had the northern factions basically falling into it. But once again, the lines were not drawn across what the specific social context of the day was. Okay, here we go. So we'll talk about elitism. Quote,
I think I'm really qualified.
I think you might be.
No.
No?
I don't know. I don't know what you're trying to say. I'm just being a douche.
I'm just saying that
I'm elite.
People that are incredibly rich.
I do.
Yeah.
I don't really know them. I've met them.
I've met them. Yeah. Your golfing buddies.
That's right.
Let's talk about Evan's golfing, but habits. After 1800, as the Federalist opposition atrophied, the original party cycle, a tension that had always existed among Jeffersonians became more important. On the one side, moderate nationalists, associated with James Madison, fully accepted the strengthening of the national government inherent in the Constitution. Though appalled by federalism's excesses and elitism, which seemed to them to endanger Republican self-government, they acquiesced in mind of the Hamiltonian economic program. Commercial development, they hoped, would provide a constant market for the nation's farmers, and a diversified economy would keep the population industrially employed. Their state governments chartered banks to supply capital for investment and credit to finance the transfer of goods. Frightened by the prolonged diplomatic and military crises between 1907 and 1915, basically the beginning of the embargo and the War of 1812, right? Mm-hmm. These development-minded Republicans of the original Republican Party, not talking about the Republican Party of Lincoln, also sought to strengthen and secure the Union. At the end of the War of 1812, therefore, they sponsored congressional legislation to tie together the country's diverse economic regions. So once again, the nation's faced with a disaster, and the nation has to act in its own self-survival, and by that process, you get nationalist economic policies, which best improve the general welfare of the people. But then that falls down because of it runs aground of running into some ruling class interest. To continue, Henry Clay was a leading congressional proponent of this nationalistic Jeffersonian economic agenda. Of course, by this time, when he's saying Jeffersonian, he's actually meaning Hamiltonian.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah. In the following years, his coherent program, known as, quote, the American System, included high protective tariffs to nourish American manufacturing and create a home market for American agricultural products, a national bank to provide a sound and uniform currency, and federal funding, infrastructure projects basically, to ease the movement of goods. In later years, when federally funded internal improvements became infeasible, Clay instead promoted distribution of federal land revenues to the states for their own improvements. So they became infeasible because a political party came on the fore that made them infeasible, because there was nothing fundamentally about them that was unfeasible.
Yeah, the technology was still developing.
Yeah, the technology didn't disappear off the face of the earth. These developments appalled the other main branch of Jeffersonians, purists known as the Old Republicans or Radicals.
Slave oligarchy.
Yeah. Oh, listen to this. Who feared the degeneration of original Jeffersonian principles.
Slavery.
Yeah. Beginning in 1801, and even more frequently after the nationalist legislation of 1816, they deplored the dangers of loose construction and consolidation. Republicans' developmental policies, other radicals feared, threatened the egalitarian and moral basis of a Republican society, and small r Republican.
You see them painting the picture of a world that doesn't exist, a sort of Republican yeoman farmer of Cincinnatus and whatnot.
Yeah.
And another thing you really have to acknowledge when you talk like libertarians and Jeffersonians in general, which are kind of the same thing, is that they'll always harp on things like corruption, railroad corruption. Oh my God, it's true. It was rampant and terrible, and I don't know if terrible, certainly rampant. But what is the corruption used for? I'd much rather have development and then you have corruption on the edges of that to make that development work. Like, for example, if we had a light rail, maglev bullet train, New York to San Francisco, I'm sure there's going to be corruption in implementing that.
Yeah.
That's a part of the game. You chalk it up to the game, and you
just factor it in as a cost of the process. Mm-hmm. You try to minimize as much as you can, but it's going to happen.
And to have that as be a block, as an argument against growth, is incredibly foolish.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to understand sort of good corruption versus anti-development corruption.
Yeah. So, imagine the same ruling class now offering the same mentality of this ruling class in the modern sense, saying to China, "Oh, because your government is corrupt, you should overthrow it." And then what? Then you're going to have an anti-development, anti-growth, anti-human government imposed in lockstep with the West, who's like, "Okay, now we got rid of that corruption, but don't worry, now we're going to crush you."
Privatize, asset strip.
You want corruption based on
growth.
Yeah, if some
real wages
spills over to the other people, that's inconsequential. Because the alternative to that is having a collapsing ship where it's lifeboat survivalist mentality of people, just pushing each other to feed the sharks, and that is a much uglier situation than corruption. How can we improve that, right? How can we mitigate corruption, make it lessened, always have it be less than what it was, but realize that that's just kind of par for the course. Anyway, other radicals feared and threatened the egalitarian and moral basis of Republican society and therefore jeopardized the revolutionary experiment in Republican self-governments almost all Americans venerated. So it's total demagogy masking self-interested economics. Mm-hmm. You look at Dave Bratt right now. He won against Eric Cantor. It's the same thing. Moralist economics, right? That everything that happens in the moral realm or the economic realm is morally justified. If you're poor or you don't have opportunity, well, that's because you're a sinner. Theological economics. And same thing back in. Right? So, what else were they going to say? Oh, we want to arrest internal improvement development, national tariff, and a national bank because these best facilitate the general welfare because we're slave oligarchs and we want to maintain our slave empire. And to have a industrialized society creates immense pressures providing a counterweight against us. To have an industrial interest in the South that would have opposed the interests of the slaveholders, as we covered with David Ricardo and Malthus, right? The interests of landed aristocracy, the financier oligarchs, and the capitalist industrialists, they can overlap to a certain meager extent, but these forces are loggerheads with each other, and they're fighting each other for dominance and social control. And so to even have them exist is a threat to the existing slave oligarchy. To have them empowered and emboldened by a national bank and a tariff.
And they're suicidal as well, because the reason why the South lost the war is because they were so anti-internal improvement. If the South was creating factories down there to process some of the cotton they were getting, they would have been able to convert those factories for war materials and be able to put up a much stauncher defense, be less reliant on Great Britain and France for arms. But their sort of philosophy of how they kept their power was absolutely opposed to those sort of things. And it was doomed to begin with.
Even the logistical total weakness of them based on, like...
No South Carolinian will march on Tennessee in shoes.
They would build railroads, but not in the public best interest, right? So it was way more corrupt than the Northern Railroad building. It was, you're going to build a railroad to my plantation, but not another mile inland, where these other people can get their produce on the trains, and they're lessen the total commodity, increase the total commodity supply, and lessen the price. So it's total self-interested just every step of the way, little feudal fiefdoms of slaveholding oligarchs running these various states.
Yeah, think of France in the 14th century, these feudal lords fighting with each other for advantage over certain situations. So that's what the South was a lot like in the run up to the Civil War.
Yeah.
These sort of feudal powers, slave oligarchs,
bickering and squabbling
with each other.
And that's why the Mongols came in and just flattened the whole continent. Like why they were unchecked, and like why the Mongols could do what they did, because they were just interfaced with these tiny little squabbling fiefdoms everywhere they went.
Yeah, conquering Russia was exactly what happened. They were never able to create the real unified fight against them.
All right, here we go. To continue. Political leaders had also quarreled about the proper character of a Republican society. That is...
See, when they talk about character and they're not talking about economics, you know something's up. They're good.
Yeah.
The flim flam is coming.
Yeah.
They're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Unless they're talking about concrete things, if they're talking about moral character and fiber and the spirit or whatever, you're getting flim flam.
People in a legislative position talking about these high ideals of abstract, moral, spiritual philosophy, you are being sold something. You are being hoodwinked. Anyway, to continue, to start over here. Political leaders had also quarreled about the proper character of a Republican society. That is, about what social and economic arrangements would best sustain citizens' virtue, their commitment to the public good or commonweal. A few radicals groused their excessive materialism of the market-oriented economy promoted by Clay and other development-minded Republicans. So they're critiquing the development economics. John Taylor of Virginia and Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina, for example, hymned paeans to a Republican simplicity and to the benefits of stable agrarian economy that valued hard, honest work done by slaves. All right, so John Taylor of, I'm parenthetically adding by slaves, because John Taylor of Virginia and Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina from slave states with predominant slave oligarchs, and I would be willing to bet that both those men owned slaves. Simultaneously, they preached Jeremiads against speculation, arcane financial manipulation, and the lust for instant wealth. Yeah, we all know that the way to make money is not to go speculate in the financial markets. It's to go buy black people and then put them to work on your plantation. That's honest money. That's honest, hard work.
And you see the sort of the red meat they throw at you, sort of like libertarians and our guy who beat Cantor. He had some real red meat, brat, but, underlying it is catastrophe.
The egalitarian ethos that had begun to effervesce during the evolution had spread rapidly. Thereafter, it also generated radicals' limits. According to that ethos, the common good demanded that the white men must attain roughly equal condition, and more important, equal rights before the law. Any legal privilege that gave unequal advantage to some seemed to pave a road towards the aristocratic, unrepublican society that all Republicans had accused Federalists of fostering. Radicals like William Duane of Philadelphia and Virginia's Taylor denounced banks and other corporations as bastions of aristocratic privilege against things opposed to equal rights.
Well, which is probably certainly a lot of truth to that. But these are slave oligarchs just calling,
the kettle black.
The kettle black, and don't look behind my curtain with my pot.
Yeah, it's like, let's attack bankers in the era in which banks were most closely associated with funding industrial projects, industrial society. Meanwhile, I'm a slaveholder, so I'm a infinitely worse force of evil than could possibly be a banker in this era.
Absolutely. But there's tons of writings stating that, slavery is the right way of civilization. It's always happened. It's been, around forever. It's in the Bible. It's ancient Rome, ancient Greece.
Just the direct, okay, fine, this is all just a song and dance to maintain slave power. Mm-hmm. But they don't do that. They're much too crafty. To continue, they condemned paper banknotes as fraudulent. Since
they're based on gold.
Yeah, gold standard. Slave power was for the gold standard. since banks often refused to redeem them for full face value. Often, yeah, if there was a run on the bank. How about that? And they castigated the new moneyed men as an artificial
Nouveau riche.
aristocracy. Yes,
Ooh.
the old money power being threatened by the new money power. The old what's an older money power than the slave power? You know, that's the oldest in the book.
Yeah, ancient Rome.
Yeah,
Crassus. And
inherently antagonistic to humble farmers and artisans. Oh,
so it's going back to romantic
yeah.
yeoman farmer of Cincinnatus and
The whole
like sort of the
litany
Jeffersonian
of
during an emergency, I'll come and take power, but then I'll go back to my books and my, architecture and my slave wives.
my delicious slave wives.
Brown sugar.
To restore social and political equality, they insisted, entrepreneurial policies such as Clay's must be checked. So, okay, a few commonalities that should already be clear to everybody. The old money power is always threatened by the new money power. They don't
Church.
particularly like it.
Read, brother.
Till it,
I'm just
yeah.
saying words.
There's commonalities. These things always exist. These are the real axioms in which buy to understand politics and history.
And you can look at it in your own time with sort of the friction that the internet money has against the old economy, whether it's the equestrians versus the optimati in Rome, the financial speculators versus the slave oligarchs in the Whig times.
The Panic of 1819 and the sharp sectional split in Congress between 1819 and 1821 over Missouri's admission as a slave state, the radical doomsayers, in contrast, were largely ignored. They lacked a sufficient popular following to control the party either in Congress or in most states, and few voters by 1816 seemed interested in the leadership rifts. Nonetheless, Secretary of the Treasury, William H. Crawford of Georgia, gave the state writers a potential national rallying point, should the events create an opportunity for a rally. The Panic of 1819 and the sharp sectional split in Congress between 1819 and 1821 over Missouri's admission to the slave state provided it. Those developments shifted the balance of power towards the radicals in a number of states and split the Jeffersonian Party in the presidential election of 1824. The Depression following the Panic of 1819 awakened tens of thousands of men to the importance of politics. Farmers who lost their property, artisans who lost their jobs or paid in worthless paper scrip, and businessmen who faced bankruptcy all turned to the government for relief from their economic plight or for retaliation in the forces that they believed had caused it. Thousands voted who had never bothered before or demanded to vote if they not have it. State politics began to revolve around debtor relief, stay laws, paper money, and banks. Newly politicized citizens seeking positive legislation to promote economic recovery gravitated towards the nationalist or pro-development wing of the party epitomized by Clay. Radicals, however, benefited most from the reaction. Well, the Panic of 1819 was basically from mismanagement of the national bank at the time, the BUS, the second bank of the United States. Now, that's going to be hyped up by the Southern slave power, but the total, the 1819 implosion was just a drop in the bucket compared to the implosion of 1837.
Yeah, deflationary versus corruption-based.
Yeah. So, and legitimately set up to blow out the industrial progress of the day, of the railroads and the canals and everything like that.
And really, I would say the main star that caused the Civil War.
Yeah, from 1837 crash slides right into the imperialist adventure of the Mexican-American War, which lays the groundwork for the division of sectional lines, which breaks up the Whig Party, which it's all very tied into each other. You see that the causality is key, right? So it's hard to even pick an era to start in because you're always wanting to go back further to further causes.
chapter on this train right now.
We'll stop at chapter 2, and then we got
only 1,500 more pages to go. That's why I like audiobooks.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Wouldn't that be nice? Jesus.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.